It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Kunnnen. Bob is an undergraduate from Ferris State University. He received his master's in economics from Western Michigan, and then he received his PhD from the University of California, San Diego in economics as well. Bob's career took him to Aquinas initially, where he became the dean of the business program for many years. And then he did a mid-career change where he went out to become one of the principal economists for Principal, the large insurance company in Des Moines. And then he went on to do the same thing as an economist and investor for AIG. So Bob has a long history with economics and economic development as well as investments. So with that, I'm going to let Bob talk to us today about the economic implications of the 2024 election.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I want you to know that Richard is my brother-in-law, and to get him to introduce me, I have to get him a lunch every time he does it. So you have to pay a price sometime. But anyway, it's fortuitous that I'm talking about this today because the Fed is going to release their decision on interest rates today at 2 o'clock. After 3 years of raising rates, it looks like we're going to see a decrease today. And the big question is it going to be 25 basis points or is it going to be 50 basis points, either 1/4% or 1/2%? But I think that Jerome Powell has made it very clear that this is the first of 2 or 3 rate decreases we're going to see before the end of the year, and how nice it is to maybe go in the other direction. It'll be really curious to see what impact this has on the equity markets, if indeed they were to go 50 basis points. And I don't know exactly how to answer that question right now, but my guess is that the equity markets are going to really like the decision they get today, and it's going to have a big impact on loans. Loan rates will come down. It's going to have a big impact on credit card debt. And as you well know, credit card debt, we're still looking at 20% plus interest rates on credit card debt. And I was telling somebody earlier that the average credit card balance in this country is $6,500. And I'm imagining that those people are going to feel pretty good about seeing a decrease in their credit card rates. So a couple of interesting stats. The first is that 63% of the people in this country right now have a negative view about where the economy is headed for the next 6 months. And in spite of the fact that we have $2 trillion worth of deficit spending, it's an interesting question as to what impact this deficit spending is going to have on the rate of inflation going forward. We had $2 trillion deficit in 2023. We're going to have $2 trillion in 2024. And as far as I can tell, that's going to continue as far as the eye can see. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. Both Republicans and Democrats have developed a very tolerant attitude toward debt. We are now at 35+ trillion dollars in credit card, in debt. I tell everybody that in 1981, the first year of the Reagan administration, we reached $1 trillion. So in the 44 years since 1981, roughly, we've gone from 1 trillion to 35+ trillion dollars. It's amazing how tolerant we've gotten, and I want to talk more about this issue of what's going on with the deficit and the implications that it's going to have for the future. So I have no plans to opine on who's going to win the election in November. I really don't know. It's such a close race at the moment that both candidates are battling for the independents in the middle. They have their core constituencies, about 45 or 46% Democrat, 45 or 46% Republican. It's the 4 or 5 or 6% of independents that are going to determine the winner of this election. And what we're seeing right now is that both candidates in the last few weeks are moderating their positions to try to pick up these independent voters. And I'm going to be really interested to see how much more we're going to see in terms of candidates, both Harris and Trump, moderating their positions to try to pick up these independents. So anyway, I think it's going to be very interesting. The other big thing that's going on is that we have an election right now where both candidates have greater than a 50% unfavorability rating. It's been a while since we've seen that. So when you go out and talk with people, it's amazing how many people have an unfavorable opinion of either one candidate or the other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all Democrats have a favorable opinion of Harris, because there are a number who don't. The same is true with Trump. And that's why I think this is going to be a very interesting election. And unlike some people, I'm not sure that either candidate is going to have a mandate to make major changes going forward, given the makeup of Congress and so forth. And it's going to make things very interesting. So here are the issues that are facing the next president, which I think are pretty significant. If you look at this, slide, we're a deeply divided nation. I mean, you got about 45 or 46%. As I said, on the Republican side, you got about 45 or 46% on the Democratic side. And it's going to be really, really difficult to get any compromise going forward on some of these major issues. And I'm going to share with you some of these major issues that we're going to have to deal with. Federal spending is out of control. I said earlier that we had a $2 trillion deficit in 2023. We're going to get to another $2 trillion this year. And as far as I can tell, it's likely that we're going to have $2 trillion in 2025 as well. And it's not a Republican problem. It's not a Democratic problem. It's both parties who are culpable in this. And I want to make that very clear. I'm not assigning responsibility to one party or the other. It's both parties now that have gotten very comfortable with accumulating debt. So since 2017, we've accumulated more than $9 trillion in debt. And deficits have consequences. And I'll show you in a few minutes a slide which will show you the impact of these accumulating deficits and how it's going to impact the federal budget going forward, and how it's going to crowd out other spending over the next 10 or 15 years. Government programs are seldom ever cut.
That's right.
We now have over 2,200 government programs that are supporting various people or causes in this country right now. In 2020, there was a little over 1,200. Look at the number today, 2,200 programs. We are passing new programs. Every Congress is passing something without figuring out a way of how they're going to fund it, which one of the reasons is why the deficit has mushroomed so much in the last few years. Interest payments are going to overwhelm other priorities in the next 20 years. And again, I'll show you the slide in a half a second. So without control of the House, a new president, whether it's on the Republican side or the Democratic side, is going to have a difficult time getting anything done going forward. That's a big issue. One of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about is what's going on with Social Security in just a second. And I think that's going to really surprise you what the projections are going forward. So there is no coherent immigration policy. I think you've seen what's happened the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, where we've had people streaming over the border and so forth. If you look at the implications that has had for various cities around the country, they're being overwhelmed. There are a lot of cities that are in serious financial trouble today. because they're having to provide housing and education to the kids of these individuals that have recently come into the country. The other big thing that's going on is this growing inequality. It's getting worse. The individuals that are at the top, they're getting more and more wealthy. I read the other day that that in the last 3 or 4 years, the increase in the number of individuals that are worth $100 million has gone up threefold. Think about that. Threefold in less than 4 years. On the other hand, if you look at the individuals that are in the lower income groups, I have no clue how they're making it today. When you look at the average income of about 70 or 80% of the population, it's less than $40,000 a year. When you look at food costs, rent, housing costs, and other things, it's amazing to me that they're able to get by. And it's one of the things that's going to have to be addressed with whomever becomes president. Then you look at growing international threats. I read the other day that Putin is thinking about dropping an atomic bomb on the Arctic Circle to test out a new nuclear weapon. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. Why do you have to do that? And do you know what the impact with that will have on that part of the world in that? And yet you look at Iran, you look at Russia, and some of the things that are going on, and it's a little frightening what we're going to be faced with over the next 4 years. So the odds of an economic slowdown have gone up considerably. I made mention of these huge deficits we're running. There's reason to believe that if we had not run a $2 trillion deficit in 2023 and $2 trillion this year, would have already been in a recession right now. So the fact that we're running these big deficits is keeping the economy going. Even the most recent report that we got on GDP for the quarter ending in June showed a significant slowing, and we're already seeing in the labor market. Labor market is cooling off very quickly, which indicates to me that the federal government is going to continue to spend. They're not going to allow that to happen, which is why I think that we're probably looking at another $2 trillion deficit next year. And again, that's going to have major implications going forward. So retirements are going to surge in the next few years. It's going to put pressure on Social Security and Medicare. The Social Security Commission within the last month reported that over the next 15 years, there's going to be a $23 trillion deficit in Social Security. $23 trillion deficit in Social Security. Now, if you want to go through this little exercise to get a feeling how big that number is, write down 23 and then put 12 zeros behind it, and you'll see how big it is. $23 trillion. No candidate, whether Harris or Trump or party, is talking about how they're going to address that going forward. You know, occasionally you hear somebody say, well, maybe we need to do some means testing, or maybe we ought to increase the amount of income that's subject to Social Security tax. But politically, it's a time bomb, and nobody wants to get hung out to dry. So it's unlikely that it's going to come up much in the current campaign as to how we're going to address this. But I'm really worried as retirements surge in the next few years. There are more and more baby boomers and individuals right behind them who are retiring that are going to be looking to Social Security and Medicare to get them by. Do you know that today, the average person who retires has about $65,000 of other assets? That's it. And they're going to be really dependent on Social Security going forward. $65,000 is going to get you nowhere for very long. You know, if you do a withdrawal of 4 or 5% a year, that's virtually nothing. And how in the world they're going to be able to survive if the Social Security payments do not accelerate is beyond me. So the issue on Social Security and Medicare is pretty significant, and it's one of those things that's going to have to be addressed. Whoops, went a little too far here, I think. Nope, I didn't. Well, I thought this was pretty good about election strategy. Um, you know, when you see all the promises that are being made today, and my reaction is, how are you going to pay for these? I mean, when you're talking about all these new programs, we're at 2,200 government programs right now, and you're proposing even more programs going forward. We're running a $2 trillion deficit. Where's that going to come from? And there seems to be this attitude out there that it doesn't matter. You can add as much debt as you want, as long as you can figure out a way to make the interest payments. Don't worry about it. So look at net interest going forward. This little chart here shows what it's been going back to about 2007, and you see that we were kind of sailing along somewhere around 10%, a few years a little bit lower than that. Beginning in 2022 and 2023, we're on this trajectory now. So over the next 15 years, interest payments on our national debt are going to go up considerably, just given the amount we have. And the problem with that is the more debt you have, the market's going to demand higher interest rates going forward. So it's highly probable that because the deficit's growing and there is so much government debt out there, people are going to demand higher interest rates in the future, which is going to exacerbate this situation even more into the future. And you can see when you go out to 2040s and 2050 and that the debt payments will be about 40% of government revenue. That's going to crowd out other investments. It's going to make it very difficult to fund other kinds of things that the federal government has to do. So does that mean that taxes are going to go up? Does it mean that Social Security is going to have to be cut? Medicare is going to have to be cut? How are they going to fund these things going forward? I think that's the issue that neither candidate is talking about as to how we're going to address this problem going forward. And I have not seen any discussion from either one of them, from either party, as to how we're going to deal with this problem. Here's another way to look at it. This shows the net interest going out to the late 2040s. Here's Social Security that continues to climb. Medicare goes up like a shot going forward as more and more people become dependent on that for their medical insurance. And then and you can see that as a percent of federal spending, as a percent of GDP, we will go up to something in excess of 8% by the time we get out to 2050. That has enormous implications for funding other kinds of programs going forward. And the fact is that more and more of us who are retired and who are dependent on Social Security and Medicare and other kinds of things, we're going to be demanding more and more of the federal government in order to survive. And I don't envy younger people today who are going to pay all these bills going forward. I look at my son, who's in his mid-30s, and I just think he's going to get overwhelmed with having to pay for all of us going forward. And so it raises a question of how that's going to be addressed. I find this to be a really interesting chart exhibit. This is financial stress levels by state. it blew my mind when I saw Michigan at number one. Think about that. About 60% of residents in Michigan are stressed out financially. 6 out of every 10 people in Michigan are under pressure. And I would have guessed that places like New York, maybe some of the southern states and so forth would have been much higher. But we're at number one. What does that say about our situation here in the state of Michigan? This number has been growing over the last 10 years significantly. And I would not be at all surprised if we go back and examine this 5 or 6 years from now, we're going to see that number considerably higher going forward. This is another interesting little chart here. This has to do with the US dollar devaluation. If you wonder why dollars don't go as far as they used to, all you have to do is look at this. We went off the gold standard around 1970, and look what happened when we moved away from that, where it was based on gold prices and so forth. Since we did that, the devaluation of the dollar has accelerated every year, every decade since that period of time. So we wonder why our money is not going as far as it used to. You can trace it to this. There's no way to control this. You know, if the government continues to print money, which they're doing, to be able to fund the deficits and so forth, this is going to continue to accelerate in the future. And it has enormous implications on the ability of people to get by if this continues to accelerate going forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Harris versus Trump on economic and social policy regulations. And I'm not going to cover every difference in that, but there are some that are pretty significant, to say the least. And I would also say that, as I addressed earlier, we're seeing both candidates moderating their positions the closer we get to the election, because they're going after those independent voters. When there's a 1-point difference between the two candidates right now, they have to do that if you want to get elected. So what are you going to do to pick up an independent voter? You got to figure out a way to placate them, to adopt a more lenient position on issues and so forth, and hopefully maybe they will vote for you going forward. So this is on taxes. And of course, many of you are familiar with Harris saying that she wanted to tax on realized capital gains. If your net worth was above a certain level, you were going to have to file financial statements every year to show what your unrealized gains were on your positions, whether it was on stock or your house or anything else. And you were going to pay a tax on that from anywhere from 4 to 8%. As you might imagine, that has created a firestorm. Can you imagine having to do that kind of analysis and to file those papers and so forth? Does that mean that if you paid a 4% tax on those unrealized gains one year, and the next year the thing went down, you'd be able to reverse course? Well, her answer is no. Once you pay the tax, that's it. And needless to say, the chances of that ever getting passed by the Congress are virtually non-existent. And I think she set a threshold that if your net worth was $100 million, you would be subject to this. Well, that might be a little bit of a challenge to get those people to go through this kind of analysis, to say the least. So she's proposed higher taxes on corporations and individuals with higher net worth. She wants to cut subsidies to corporations, and a tax hike on corporations much higher than what Biden had proposed. The last proposal I saw from her was that corporations would go from something like the low 20s to about 30% going forward. Now, my reaction to that is that there's always another reaction you get when you increase taxes on corporations, and invariably it's going to affect employment. If you start increasing the taxes that they're paying, they're going to look for ways to cut costs. And that means they're going to have to figure out a way to get rid of employees, get rid of benefits and other kinds of things. It's not as easy as what it sounds when you talk about increasing taxes and so forth, because corporations are not stupid. The people that run these things are going to look for ways to offset those costs. And that means people, other kinds of expenses, and that's going to have a big impact on the economy if we were to go in that particular direction. So over on Trump's side, he wants to extend his tax cut, in which is to lower taxes on corporations to stimulate economic growth. We're already running major deficits. I mean, $2 trillion this year, $2 trillion last year. If you cut taxes even more, the probability is that we could be looking at maybe a $3 trillion federal deficit going forward. And I don't even know how to react to that, given the impact that'll have on the economy and so forth. Not only is it inflationary, but it becomes a bigger problem in the future, as I pointed out earlier. The other big thing he wants to do is to increase tariffs. I did a paper one time on the impact of tariff increases on the economy. It's very interesting. When you increase tariffs, it's going to increase the cost of those items that are being imported into the US. Not surprisingly, when you do that to another country, they're going to reciprocate. So if we do that, for instance, to Japan, that we import a lot from, or China, you're going to get a reaction from them. They're going to say, we're going to do the same thing to you. And it's fair to argue that one of the reasons why the Depression was such a difficult period is we were increasing tariffs very quickly because the economy was in trouble. And they were looking for a way to raise revenue in that, where everybody else was doing the same thing. Probably the Depression lasted a lot longer than it did because of this tariff problem that was going on around the world, because every country was doing the same thing. And you can go back and look at that period of time and see the number of months where we increased the tariffs on other countries on various goods that were coming into the country because we were trying to stimulate our own production. It doesn't work. The reality is it's going to work against your long-term interests and the world's interests if we go in that direction. So when he makes this proposal that the way to solve our deficit is to increase tariffs, it just does not work. And everything I've seen, the research I've done and so forth, indicates that it'll be counterproductive to growth here in the United States and around the world. So this is on climate action. Harris wants to propose higher carbon emission taxes and favors a more aggressive move toward EVs and other alternative energy sources. It's interesting to note that EV sales are headed south. There was a plant that was proposed for the state of Michigan that's now been scrubbed for the production of EV vehicles. And we're seeing that across the country, that EV sales are headed downhill. And one of the recent polls that was done among EV owners was, are you happy about your decision to purchase an EV? 50% of the individuals that own EVs would not do it again today. What does that say? I found that amazing. You know, you spend, those are very expensive. And so they buy an EV vehicle and they're already disappointed in what they have and so forth. It's not surprising that EV sales are headed down at the moment. And I think they're saying, well, give me my old carbon emission vehicle. At least I know I can go to the gas station and put gas in it. I don't have to worry about a charging station or any of that kind of stuff. And they're also finding that the mechanics on an EV are not quite as dependable as what was thought. In other words, they're ending up having to have more service done on them. And not surprisingly, the service work is more expensive than it is with a regular carbon emission vehicle. So I think people are getting somewhat surprised by those right now. So other green energy initiatives, you know, they're talking about solar power and things of that nature. I don't know. I haven't reached a final conclusion on that yet. I guess it makes some sense to look at some of those options in that, but it's going to be a long time before we get to the point where these other green initiatives are going to have much of an impact. Then, of course, Donald, his way of dealing with this is let's just drill for more oil. And his famous statement is drill, baby, drill. And I think that if he becomes president, he's going to open up more and more areas to drill for oil in that to try to get gas prices down and so forth. And that's the way that we're going to deal with some of these shortages we have and maybe make things more economical for people to drive around. The problem with that drill, baby, drill is when I look at the oil industry, and I spent a lot of time looking at this around the country and so forth, is I'm not sure that there's enough oil in the ground to be able to accomplish what he's proposing. When you look at what we've done around the country and so forth, and how many oil wells have gone dry and so forth, and the other restrictions that states have on drilling and so forth, I don't know if this is a very meaningful suggestion and whether or not it's plausible that we would be able to go in that direction. So one of the things that's kind of interesting to look at is their policy on Gaza. As you all know right now, this is kind of a hot topic. I think a lot of people are worried that we're going to end up in a major war in the Middle East, given what's going on in that part of the world. Harris is suggesting an immediate ceasefire and without conditions. That is the Israelis need to be much more flexible in Gaza in dealing with Hamas and Hezbollah and so forth. Trump says unless there are major concessions from Hezbollah and Hamas, there's no reason for the Israelis to enter into a ceasefire. My reaction to this is, I don't care what they do. This is not going away. I heard going way back to the 1950s and 1960s that ultimately we would find a solution to the problems in the Middle East, that we would figure out a way to make sure that the Israelis and those in other countries around there would find some solutions to getting into these chronic wars and that. This never happened. You just moved from one thing to the next. And so I'm not optimistic that this is going to result in meaningful progress going forward. And I'm still really worried that this current situation is going to develop into a bigger war between the Israelis and other countries in that part of the world. And that has enormous implications, not only for the people in that area, but also for the oil industry. If indeed we were end up in a war in the Middle East that would go on for some period of time, would have enormous impact on oil prices going forward. We've seen that before. If you go back and look at some of the other conflicts in the Middle East, whenever we've had a battle that's broken out, it's driven up oil prices substantially. And that's going to have an impact on us because we still import a lot of oil into this country. And I think they're trying to find some solutions to this. I'm just not sure it's going to work. I see no evidence that either Hezbollah or Hamas is going to back off anytime soon. The bottom line is they hate the Israelis. And the Israelis are not exactly tolerant of them. The likelihood that we're going to see a ceasefire anytime soon, in my judgment, is just simply not going to happen. So business regulation. This is kind of an interesting one because when you look at the position that Harris takes on this, she believes that corporations and so forth are going to have to be scrutinized much more carefully going forward. And she wants more accountability on the part of corporations in that. I think she doubts the veracity of some of the financial reports that are being issued by corporations in that. By the way, I want to say that in fairness to her, I do as well. I look at a lot of financial reports and so forth, and I must confess that sometimes when I read those, I almost start laughing. And so I get what she's saying, that the rules, even though you think that the federal government, the Securities and Exchange Commission does a good job of monitoring this, the reality is they don't. And corporations have a lot of latitude to do things that, in my judgment, are somewhat questionable. The problem with that is if you start imposing more regulations on these companies than that, it can be inflationary. They're going to have to figure out a way to meet all these new rules and so forth. What are they going to do? They're going to jack up the prices on their products and so forth. That contributes to inflation, which can be counterproductive to the growth of the economy and that. So it's a really interesting dilemma that we're faced with if we go in that direction. Can you argue that there needs to be some additional rules in that? Absolutely. I mean, we all know that companies will take a lot of latitude in how they report different things and so forth. And should they do a better job on some of these things? Completely. But if you start doing a lot of that, that becomes counterproductive to growth in the economy. And not surprisingly, Trump's attitude about this is, well, let's get rid of a lot of these regulations. Just make it much more open. I'll tell you a quick story. In 1991, I had the fortuitous pleasure, and I use that term very loosely, of being on the Trump Taj Mahal Senior Secured Bankruptcy Committee. The Trump Taj Mahal, which by the way is not even open anymore, was a major casino that was built in Atlantic City. He referred to it as the eighth wonder of the world. The company that I was doing some work for at that time out in Des Moines, we bought some of their bonds, casino bonds, and they paid a very good rate of interest. Within 1 year, they were in default. He spent way over the budget. One example of that is they had a crystal chandelier in the main casino ballroom that cost $50 million. Think about that. And I remember when I visited just prior to the close of this transaction, walking into that place, and my reaction was, oh my God, what else has he been spending money on? Every time you turned around, they were overspending on things related to this casino. 12 months later, it went into default. Within a year or two, this $800 or $900 million casino was sold to Carl Icahn, another name in the world of finance, for $300 million. He thought this is a great deal. $300 million for something that cost $800 million. I can make money very easily with this. Within 2 or 3 years, everything was shut down. He lost everything. So the moral of the story is be really careful. In Trump's case, he allowed his ego to get out of control in terms of building this thing. You know, referring to a casino as the eighth wonder of the world, I mean, that really is kind of crazy. And at least for a few months, everybody in the world was going there. They wanted to see what this thing looked like. And then they stopped going. They went other places. And so anyway, it's kind of an interesting situation. And in that particular situation, the reporting that was done by the Trump organization on what they were actually spending was almost non-existent. As bondholders, we got very little information about how much they were actually spending on some of these things and that. And so you could argue that if there had been more regulation at that time, maybe some of us would have been more cognizant of what was actually going on. I don't know whether that's true or not, because I still think there would have been ways to have camouflage some of this spending and so forth. This is one of my favorite topic, deficits. If you look at what Harris has said about this, she basically has no inclination to rein in spending. She has basically said that, well, maybe I can increase taxes going forward that'll help bring down the deficit and so forth. But it's not clear cut whether or not she would have enough votes in Congress to actually get this done. So additional taxation will bring down the deficit. I think it's highly unlikely that Congress is going to have an appetite to increase taxes in the near future, even though every once in a while they'll talk about this and going forward in that. So Trump, not surprisingly, maybe one of his advisors got to him and said, don't talk about this. He's been really silent on this and very little about deficit reduction. We're at $35.5 trillion right now with our federal overall federal deficit, federal debt. If that continues to grow at the rate of $2 trillion a year, it's going to take up much more of revenue, federal revenue going forward to make the interest payments in that. It's going to make it very, very difficult to fund other things down the line. And yet you don't hear anyone talking about it. Have you heard either one of the candidates talk about the federal deficit? They're both strangely silent on this, and there's a good reason why they're strangely silent, because they don't have a solution. Neither one of them has given a solution of how we're going to deal with this going forward. 2,200 government programs that are spending money on various things right now. In some cases, we don't even know what they're spending the money for. You may have read some of the things in the Wall Street Journal and that, reporting on various agencies and that, who don't have a good handle on how they're spending this money. Yeah, we just keep going ahead and no one seems to be worrying about it. So this is on immigration, another interesting issue, given all the commentary on this today. Harris favors a comprehensive immigration package, but with broad limits. That language with broad limits is very interesting because she's never defined what broad limits are. And it makes you wonder a little bit what she has in mind about that. Broad limits, what does that mean? You can come in and as long as you come in legally and so forth, you can do whatever you want to do, and the government will continue to provide you with housing and education for your kids and so forth. I don't know. Amnesty for existing individuals and a path to citizenship. What does that mean for all the people that came into the country legally and went through the normal procedure of getting into the country and that, to see that individuals may get a path to citizenship even though they broke rules to get in? I don't know. That strikes me as interesting. Major economic implications. It's estimated that in some cases, individuals that are getting help for housing and other kinds of things are on this for 5 or 6 years after they're here. That's going to have a big impact on the states, the cities, and the federal government who are having to provide all of this aid going forward. And all you have to do is to look at the budget at the federal level, the state level, and the city level to see how much money is going to support these individuals that are coming into the country. Now, I have nothing against immigration, by the way. My grandparents immigrated from the Netherlands 80 or 90 years ago. And, we benefited from having our family here in the United States and so forth. They got no assistance whatsoever when they came to the US. They got assistance from their community, from the church they were a member of, things of that nature, but there was no support at the city, the state, or the federal level back at that time, and yet they were able to function very well. Today, it's totally turned around, and more and more the state, city, and the federal budgets are going for these kinds of programs. So it has major economic implications. And Trump, he's got a very good short-term strategy. I'm just going to deport them all. I'm going to put them on a plane and have them go somewhere else. Interestingly enough, France, in the last 10 days, has announced a new program. For anyone who came into France illegally, if you go back to where you came from, they're going to give you $30,000. Think about that. So it's kind of an interesting strategy, isn't it? If you say you're willing to go back to the country you came from, we're going to write you a check. Just don't come back again, because you'll get arrested if you come back again. Kind of an interesting way to deal with immigration. He says it's not necessary to have a new policy. Just go ahead and enforce the existing regulations we have. And I don't know if that's going to work very well either, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem across the country. I read the other day that Springfield, down south of us, has a major budget deficit, and they're worried whether or not they're going to be able to continue financially, given what's going on. I'm sure you've seen what's going on in California. They had a $65 billion deficit going into the next fiscal year, and they're having to try to figure out a way to deal with it. California has lost 500,000 people in the last couple of years who have moved out because of what's going on in the state. They're, I think they've cut like $20 billion so far, but they've got to find a lot more to get their budget in order. Question is, why are they all leaving the state? High housing costs, other kinds of inflation, crime. Where are they going? Texas, Arizona, places like that to get away from California. 500,000 people have moved out of the state, and they're estimating that that's going to continue over the next year. Economic inequality. As I said earlier, inequality is becoming a bigger problem in this country. Harris favors more government programs to reduce inequality paid by more taxes. We have 2,200 government programs right now that are funding all kinds of other things. The idea that somehow we're going to add a number of additional programs to deal with this is not exactly reassuring, to say the least. More government-sponsored medical. Medicare is running a huge deficit, and it's accelerating. The idea that somehow you're going to put all of these people onto Medicare and things like that is going to exacerbate that problem even more going forward. And I'm sure you're aware, I mean, we all get our Medicare bills on a regular basis, how much that's gone up over the last few years. Every time I open that thing up, I sit here and I think to myself, you got to be kidding me. Um, I mean, it's becoming progressively more expensive to carry insurance and so forth. The big thing is she supports reparation payments. Now, she softened her position on that a little bit. California had a big initiative to impose provide reparation payments to various minorities. I think there was 5 or 6 different parts of that plan. Governor Newsom actually vetoed 4 parts of that. One part is going through, though, in terms of providing reparation payments to various groups and so forth. I said earlier that they were already running a huge budget deficit. This is hardly going to do anything to improve that situation going forward. And Trump goes back to the standard thing. Well, the way to get rid of inequality is to grow the economy faster. If we grow the economy, everybody gets taken in, and that'll help to reduce this inequality. The problem is that just doesn't happen. It's the individuals who are at the top of the food chain who benefit. The individuals who are down below hardly enjoy any of those benefits. So I'm not sure that growth is going to provide an answer to this going forward. Tariffs and other duties. This is kind of an interesting subject, as I talked about earlier. She does not favor import tariff increases as being counterproductive to trade and expensive to consumers. I agree with that point completely. I think it's obvious that that would be counterproductive. She's ambivalent about cryptocurrencies. So am I, by the way. Every time I look at cryptocurrencies and that, I think, you got to be kidding me. I get it that people like to gamble, but I don't understand it. And you're absorbing a lot of risk. You start investing in cryptocurrencies and that, all you have to do is look in the Wall Street Journal every day and see what the volatility is in those. And it makes you feel like you want to be in the stock market. Stock market has volatility too, but the cryptocurrencies are all over the map. Trump supports tariff increases to reduce the taxes, and he's a big fan of cryptocurrencies. I don't get it. I mean, I look at that and I think this is about as much risk as you ever want to take on. What is the advantage of cryptocurrencies? There really is no standard as to how those things are. It's supply and demand. Anyway, so those are the differences on tariffs and so forth. So this is dealing with the candidates' positions on Social Security, Medicare, and what they're planning on doing. I don't see a plan from either one of them on how this is going to be addressed going forward. Neither candidate has provided much information as to how they're going to solve these problems. No one wants to talk about this. And somebody asked Kamala Harris the other day how she was going to address the Social Security problem. She immediately pivoted to a different subject. And Trump is no better. And I don't think either candidate has a solution of how they're going to deal with this projected $23 trillion deficit over the next 15 years in that area. So some of the things that have been brought up is let's change the eligibility requirements, more contributions by making more income subject to tax, increase the retirement age. Wonder how that's going to go over. Imagine telling somebody who's 60 or 61, hey, guess what? You can't retire now until you're 67 or 68. That's probably not going to fly very well and could cost them some votes. They may have to consider that in the future, given some of these issues with funding going forward. That earlier chart I showed you why this is a major problem going forward. All solutions have issues attached, and it may not be politically expedient to implement some of these things. So what do? You ignore them. And that seems to be going on in both parties right now. Nobody wants to deal with it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about Social Security. They don't want to talk about Medicare. Let's wait until it really becomes a big problem. I think that has some risk connected to it. So neither candidate has a real good strategy for the deficit, which is going to become a much bigger problem going forward. I showed you that chart earlier that how much of federal revenue is going to be spent on interest payments going forward. That's going to crowd out other spending going forward and affect other kinds of programs in that. And I think that's going to be problematic. So what happens? I'm really curious of what you folks think about this. Go ahead. You realize this is going to cost me another lunch.
Um, over the last few years, there's been a shift in Medicare from regular Medicare to Medicare Advantage. And Medicare Advantage has made significant cuts to the insurance companies that manage that. And so they have made some major changes in how Medicare Advantage works.
Yeah, I again, I think that if you look at the cost increases, the reality is that all of us who were in the baby boom generation, and I think that period of time from 1946 or 47 through the 1950s, there were a lot of us who were born during that period of time. We're all retiring now, and we're dependent on that. And if you look at the cost increases, I just look at the cost increases I get from my own doctor and going in on a regular basis. It blows me away. Even if I don't see him, just seeing his chief nurse and some of the other people, it's very expensive and so forth. And as you well know, the amount that's being reimbursed has gone down. And so more and more you're seeing a bill from your doctor. Well, guess what? Your private insurance and your Medicare and so forth, they're not paying as much as they used to. And it's a totally different world right now. And then you look at the cost of prescription drugs. It blows me away what some of these drugs cost today, and yet more and more of us are dependent on those. You ask somebody how many prescriptions are you taking today, and you say, I look at just myself. I'm taking 3 of them, and but I know people that are taking 10 or 12 of them. And I'm amazed they can even function with how many different things they're taking. I remember this one gentleman I'm pretty good friends with, and I said, do you know what the interaction of all these drugs are? And he says, well, I don't have a clue. But he says, I don't think it's good. So, but how do we deal with the problem today? If you got something wrong with you, you go to the doctor and say, I need a drug. I don't care what it is, I need it. And so, you just go to the pharmacy today and you look at all the things that are stacked up, waiting for people to pick up. And I look at that and I think, oh my God, how much are some of these people taking? So anyway, it's a big issue. Go ahead.
A comment and then a question. This morning, it came out on the radio that Social Security is getting a break. There was less expenditures and more income, and now the date has been pushed out to 2034 before it goes broke. But you mentioned about inflation and printing money. Can you actually explain, the government doesn't really print money, do they, and hand it out to everybody, isn't it? With the T-bills or something as to how they do that?
Sure, if you look at the the way the budget is set and so forth, if they're going to run a $2 trillion deficit and so forth, they're going to do deficit spending and so forth, and that's what they do. But they'll print money on a regular basis, and yes, and there is no standard. It used to be when you were tied into the gold standard that you had to follow a procedure, a prescribed procedure to be able to do that. Today, that no longer exists. So if they decide that they want to increase the money supply, which is not unusual, they just do it. I mean, for years, Milton Friedman, who was a very distinguished economist, talked about this printing of money that was going on and how counterproductive it was to the currency to be doing this. That's gone. I don't think that there's any standard anymore. And if they feel that they need to put more money into the economy to support their programs and that, they just do it. You're hanging around with the wrong people. Yeah, but it's not unusual. I mean, I've gone into various establishments and that, and they'll get me change in that, and this money will look brand new. And I often think to myself, well, they're at it again. Obviously, the presses are busy, and but I think it's disconcerting when you think that the Federal Reserve has lost the ability to control the money supply, that they're not cognizant of what happens when you just continue to print money like that. And you see that with that dollar devaluation chart, that that's occurring for a reason, that every dollar that we have is worth less than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's worth less than it was a year ago. Well, there's a reason for that. And that is that if you're just simply printing money and you're allowing the money supply to grow at 3, 4, 5, or 6% a year, it's going to devalue the currency. And my big fear is that the Federal Reserve is not anywhere as responsible as they were years ago. They're less cognizant about that devaluation thing. I think if you look at previous individuals who have headed up the Federal Reserve, whether it was Janet Yellen or Arthur Burns or some of the others, they had a much better handle on that, and they were more cognizant of what happens when you do that. But that devaluation chart, I think, is pretty evident that that dollar bill you have in your pocket has been depreciated substantially in the last 40 years. You look at what it costs to go to the grocery store or other things today compared to what it did 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Yeah, some of it can relate to production and so forth, but it also can relate to the fact that that dollar is not worth as much as it used to be. And the problem is that individuals who are in the lower income categories are getting hurt the most. A lot of us, yeah, we're aware of it. I mean, we go in there and you pay a ridiculous sum of money for a steak or something of that nature. Yeah, we can get by. But for individuals who are living on a fixed income, very limited budget in that, it has an enormous impact. And I worry about those people who are down at that level. going forward, because if we don't get a handle on this, their situation is going to get worse and worse over time. And incomes are not growing anywhere near as fast as they used to. I think in the last couple of years, you know, if you got a 2 or 3 or 4% increase in your wages, you probably felt pretty good about it. But prices were going up at 8 or 9%. It's come down now. We're back down to about 3.5%, but you're still losing ground. And what does that mean going forward? I think there's a good chance that if inflation picks up again going forward, and it will, if we run another $2 trillion deficit in 2025, there's no question in my mind that inflation is going to pick up again. What's going to happen to people if we go through another cycle like that? And so I'm a little concerned about the Federal Reserve and the way they're managing the currency and so forth. I grew up in a period of time where that was an important issue in terms of control of the money supply and so forth. That's changed a lot now. I'm sorry, I was going off on a tangent.
Yeah, you paint a pretty dark picture here. I mean, there's no solution on this side or no on the right or the left. I just got a story or two to tell you. I have had 2 sons who lived in Europe quite in the last 50 years. Anyway, I just want to talk about healthcare for just between 08 and 011, one son had 3 normal births. One in Paris, one in Brussels, and one in Denver, Colorado.
Mhm.
We tried to do an evaluation of the costs in those 3 locations. The conclusion was that it was almost 4 times the cost in Denver as it was in Paris,
Mhm.
and about 3.5 times the cost in Denver as it was in Brussels.
Right.
Both universal coverage
Mhm.
systems. Now, it's hard to get and find out what is really being spent. We didn't look at where did this money come from a charity or taxes or wherever. The machine to do for example, the sonogram in Denver was made by Siemens Corporation in Germany. The same machine was used in Paris. Guess the difference in cost to push that button in that location as opposed to Denver. Now, what you see in universal coverage is that the infant mortality rate in France at that time compared to the infant mortality rate in Kent County, you know, the sum of the gross national product that we spend in this country on healthcare. Healthcare is a profit center in this country.
Mhm.
In the early 90s, I was there. I had a child who needed, my grandson needed help. He had fever and so on. In a little suburb of Paris. My daughter-in-law called up the doctor. The doctor said, you can come to the office. There's going to be, you're going to be exposed to a lot of other little kids, but I can come to your house about 5 o'clock at night. The reason he is going to get paid a little more if he makes a house call. So he makes a house call. And he comes and he's got his medicine in a bag, a black bag. And my question is, for example, in we are spending twice as much and more for results in terms of health care. We have tremendous fraud in our systems. I don't think we are capable politically as a country to come up with a healthcare system that makes sense and that is regulated. Can't do that. And if we did, it would take us 50 years to adjust to a system. My daughter-in-law, who is German, sees a doctor in her country 4 times more often. They don't have shortages.
Yeah.
You know, we got good doctors, we got good training centers, we got good nurses, but we got a system that is just incapable of really making.
You know, speaking to that. Speaking to that point, I was talking with a friend of mine 2 days ago, down in Indiana. He had a torn retina in one of his eyes, and he ended up going in and having surgery on it. He was basically could not drive or see anything for about 3 months out of that eye. The cost of that was $100,000 to have that repaired, $100,000. Some of
Well,
it
they
was,
don't even make sense.
yeah, some of it was covered by insurance and so forth. Now, obviously, he's got about 3/4 of his eyesight back, but he still has problems. $100,000 to have that retina repaired. I mean, it blew me away when he was telling me the cost of having had that done and so forth.
But getting back to your corporate tax,
Right.
I mean, that's a step in the right direction. In 1975, how much of our federal budget do you think came from the corporate tax? 75, 50 years ago,
I'd have to go back and
a
look.
little over 40%.
Was it
Yeah,
that?
now, where are we? We got a lot of corporations that are not paying taxes. It's less than 20. When you have money making policy, and that's what you got here.
All
And
you
the
have to,
church,
all you have to do is look at, for instance, if you invest in real property, real estate and so forth, when you look at the amount you can write off for amortization on the property and things of that nature,
did Trump ever pay any
it's,
taxes? Do you
it's
think?
hard. It's hard not to make money investing in real estate and so forth, given all the things that you can do and so
Yeah.
forth. Anyway,
I suspect it's the insurance companies and the pharmaceuticals that are making all that money. That's the difference between us and
Yeah.
Europe. But my question is really small compared to that. I wonder if you have any idea what the justification was for putting a cap on Social Security. Like after you make, I don't know, a couple $100,000, you don't pay any more Social
No,
Security. There's no common sense with that. mean,
I have no explanation for that.
Oh, well.
I mean, you can make a very good case why that ought to be removed and so forth, and it would certainly help
It's the easiest
in
thing
terms
to
of
do.
dealing with some of the funding issues going forward. And but I would also say that it would be a politically difficult decision for politicians to go in that direction. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're reluctant to do it, because it has consequences. Keep in mind that a lot of these individuals who are making a lot of money in that are the ones that are making the most significant contributions to candidates in that. And do you want to alienate that group? Right.
I want to go back to Bitcoin.
Yeah. I was afraid somebody was going to bring that up.
Who runs Bitcoin now?
How, what?
Who runs Bitcoins now?
Well, I'd have to go back and look at what their structure is, but it's kind of an unregulated market that's driven by supply and demand and so forth. And my problem is that I'm not sure that there's the right kind of oversight over the crypto markets and so forth. And it's kind of like the Wild West. You know, if if everybody gets excited about a particular crypto, the value goes up and so forth, but you can have the reverse impact where everybody decides to exit it and you're hung out to dry.
This is what I see. It doesn't seem to be picking up good, but I've had the feeling when Trump was in before, he was trying to make everything that was government run
Yeah,
by people,
right.
but people of money.
Well, you know what Warren Buffett,
And then Bitcoin might be the same kind of a thing.
Yeah.
That's what.
you know
might
what
be
Warren
why
Buffett says about
he
crypto.
favors it.
You know what Warren Buffett says about cryptocurrencies? He said, it's a fool's game. And if you're dumb enough to invest in that area, then so be it, but don't complain.
But the government hasn't taken it on either, so.
I will, my turn? No. You've painted a very dire picture.
Oh, I'm
of-
sorry.
Yeah, a very dire picture of all these things, but to be perfectly honest, I have an economics undergrad degree from 1972 at Tennessee University. And I heard the same thing then. You know, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. We have no control over spending.
Mhm.
And I remember 10 or 15 years ago, Greece had a huge financial crisis and were forced into austerity against their will. And it really worked for them. So I'd like to ask, what sort of event do you think would force the US to have to behave rationally? None of us can run deficits in our own countries or our churches or our
No,
companies.
based on your comment, you understand why economists are never invited to parties.
Yes.
I can't remember the last time I was invited to one because somebody will start asking me a question and I'll go off on a tangent about it. But I want you to think about Mark Twain. He had a quote one time. He says, "I'm an old man and I've known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened." And I think there's some truth to that all I'm trying to do is to point out some of the issues that the next president, the next Congress is going to have to deal with that are problematic. And the one that I'm most concerned about is the growth of the federal deficit, because that has enormous consequences in that. Some of the others, we can probably figure out a way to deal with those. But I don't see anybody who's addressing these. And that worries me a little bit that we're just ignoring this and we're going to leave it to a future generation to deal with this. And if anything, the problem is going to get worse going forward. So again, by the way, if anybody's having a party and you need an economist, I'm available. The fact that half the people might leave before the end of the evening, don't worry.
You showed a slide earlier that had the expenses versus the GDP, I believe.
Say that one more
You
time.
had a chart up earlier that showed expenses versus GDP.
Yes,
And that was 9%. Is that
yes.
correct? Is that the same thing as the ratio, the GDP to debt?
Yeah, it is. And if you look at how fast that's been growing and what's going to happen over the next 10 or 15 years, that's when it becomes even a much bigger issue. And what I see is that it's going to crowd out other kinds of initiatives and so forth. And I worry about that because the needs in this country are growing. I talked already about the inequality that's going on and what's happening to lower income groups and so forth. They're going to need additional help in the future. And if we're spending more and more money and making interest payments on the national debt, what does that say about their situation?
Isn't the argument that as long as that ratio is not, as long as we're growing and the GDP goes up, the debt doesn't matter so much? Isn't that justification for more debt?
You know, I have heard that argument so often over the years that don't worry about debt. And what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years is that both parties now have that view. It used to be that the Republicans had a negative view about debt growth. Well, that's changed. both parties have become much more comfortable with having deficits every year. And my attitude about that is that may work in the short term, but longer term, it has some major implications. Can you imagine what would happen if we went into a serious slowdown? We had another recession or two, and we had a situation where debt was growing at that level. That may impact our ability to be able to address that going forward. So I'm worried about deficits. I'm worried about the attitude in this country that it doesn't matter. I worry about people who put more and more things on credit cards in that. You know, this attitude is, hey, you got this credit card, let's just stick the thing on there. Well, that has implications connected to it. And by the way, I should mention that that credit card defaults are growing right now. When I'm looking at all the banks and that, what they're reporting and so forth, they are growing significantly right now. Invariably, that's been a precursor to a serious economic slowdown. So it'll be interesting to watch whether that continues to be the case. I'm also seeing that in the corporate sector. We're beginning to see defaults increase in corporate high yield bonds and other kinds of corporate debt and things of that nature. That indicates to me that there's a lot of stress in the system. What does that mean going forward? Does that mean that we're going to have a major slowdown?
I don't know why my mind is going in this direction, but I think about what I heard at one time with Roosevelt wanting us to get into World War II to improve the economy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that will end up being our solution.
Isn't it interesting, by the way, when you look at it took us 180 years to get to a $1 trillion deficit that we did in 1981. All through the way through World War I, World War II, the Depression, and all of that, we didn't get to $1 trillion. In spite of what was going on in financing wars and things of that nature, suddenly there's this whole different attitude. Deficits don't matter. If you can borrow the money, have at it. And to me, that's kind of an irresponsible attitude and is not indicative of a proper management of your economy when you don't think about things like that.
I absolutely agree with you that the prescription drug prices have just gotten skyrocketing. They're terrible. I also believe that when they allowed them to advertise drugs, that had to increase the cost of the drugs. And then when we all are exposed to these drugs on TV or wherever you see these advertisements, you go into your doctors and demand the drug. I mean, it only benefits these companies. Why don't we put an end to advertising drugs?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have a question from online.
Yep. Got about 4 minutes left. Then you're all relieved of this.
Okay, so thank you for addressing people online. Some have proposed that automation and robotics should be taxed. One way to do this would replace payroll taxes with the VAT tax. What do you think about that?
Try that one more time.
Value added tax to replace payroll taxes.
Well, I have to think about that for a while. I don't really have a good answer for that at the moment, but I think the whole area of taxation needs to be examined because I think there are problems throughout it. I don't care whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. There are major issues right now. There are major issues in terms of the enforcement in that. When I look at the number of individuals that are behind in terms of their federal tax payments and so forth, that number is growing each and every year. And it's almost like, come after me, see if you can collect it. And I think that's becoming more and more problematic that there's this attitude in this country, you don't have to pay your taxes. And the penalties connected with that are rarely ever enforced when that happens and so forth. So I think you create this environment where it makes it even worse. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's individuals at the lower income level or individuals that are making a lot of money every year. Everyone's playing the game. I'm very aware of tax policy because I'm invested in some retail properties. And I look at what's done in terms of minimizing your taxes and that, you'd be amazed at what you can do. How you can play the system, how you can game the system to lower your tax liability and so forth. There's a reason why all this money is going into commercial real estate today. People are learning this. And it's not just the individuals who have been doing this for a long time. Suddenly you've got funds that are set up now that you can invest in for as little as $50 to get some of the same advantages and somebody manage it for you. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing, what we've created.
Okay, I mean, we need to kind of wrap it up, I think.
Yep.
I mean, we've got lots of hands up here, so I think what I'd rather do is trying to do that is Bob will stay around for a few minutes afterwards, but I'd like to thank Bob for another stimulating conversation and
Thank you. If you're asking me to stay around for a while, does that mean I don't have to pick up lunch today?
absolutely not.
Thank you very much, folks. I appreciate it. Some good questions, though. I appreciate that. Yep.
My question is going to the international scene, going to Canada. What kind of a deficit do some of these other countries have that provide free health insurance? Everything? Where are they?